Hello, Dan Alasso here again with Chapter 6 of my U.S. History 1 course, or text, or web text, depending on how you're viewing this. And this chapter I'm calling Awakening, because it's about both a religious revival that we call the First Great Awakening, and also the beginnings of a sense or a feeling on the part of some British colonists in America that something was changing. And this, of course, will lead to the American Revolution, next chapter. So, here we go. The British colonies, we want to remember, grew during a time when much of North America, especially the Northeast, were engaged in frequent war. Generations of colonial families experienced battle firsthand. Now, in the 18th century, fighting was seasonal. Armies would tend to mobilize in the spring and fight in the summer, and then retire to their winter quarters in the fall. The British Army imposed a very harsh discipline on its soldiers, most of whom were drawn from the lower classes, from the poor. And the idea was to ensure that they wouldn't step out of line during engagements. Literally, that they wouldn't step out of line, that they wouldn't break formation. If they did, officers would kill them. On the battlefield, armies dressed in these bright colored uniforms to advertise their lack of fear. The British dressed in red to also hide blood. They stood in tight formation, and they exchanged volleys of close-range musket fire with the enemy. Now, in reality, troops often feared their officers more than they did the enemy. And most imperial conflicts had both American and European fronts, leaving history and historians with two or more names for each war. For instance, King William's War from 1688 to 1697 was also known as the War of the League of Augsburg, and sometimes as the 9-Year War. In America, most of the fighting in this conflict took place between New England and New France. Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713, is also known as the War of Spanish Succession. England fought against both Spain and France this time over who would inherit the Spanish throne after the last Habsburg ruler died. In North America, the fighting took place in Florida, and in New England, and in New France. In Canada, the French held their own, but they lost Acadia and Newfoundland to the English. The English failed to take Quebec, which would have given them complete control over Canada. Queen Anne's War is best remembered in the United States for the French and Indian raid against Deerfield, Massachusetts in 1704. A small French force combined with a native group made up of Catholic Mohawks and Pocumtucks attacked the frontier village of Deerfield, killing dozens of people and taking 112 prisoners. Among the captives was a 7-year-old, the daughter of Deerfield's minister named Eunice Williams. She lived with the Mohawks for years as the minister, John Williams, tried to ransom her and bring her back to civilization. And during that time, she assimilated into the tribe. To the horror of Puritan leaders, she grew up Indian, and she married a Mohawk man and had several children with him and converted to Catholicism and refused to return to New England. The War of Jenkins' Ear from 1739 to 1742 was mostly about control of Georgia and trade with the interior. This was a conflict between Britain and Spain over claims to the land between the Carolinas and Spanish Florida that was being filled by the new colony of Georgia. King George's War from 1744 to 1748, which is known in Europe as the War of the Austrian Succession, which lasted actually from 1740 to 1748, is kind of rolled together with the War of Jenkins' Ear and was fought in the northern colonies and in New France. In 1745, the British took control of the massive fortress at Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia, which the French had fortified to protect the mouth of the St. Lawrence River and Quebec. So this was a huge victory for the New England troops that were supported by the Royal Navy. However, 3 years later, under the terms of the treaty that ended that war, Britain gave back control of the fortress to the French, much to the surprise and consternation of the New Englanders. The First Great Awakening began in the 1720s and the early 1730s in Great Britain as an evangelical revival that created the Methodist denomination. In North America, revivalism began in 1734 in Northampton, Massachusetts, when Congregational minister Jonathan Edwards began to preach a series of sermons claiming that people could be saved by faith alone. And this created immediate enthusiasm, especially among young people who began reporting mystical experiences and visions. When the British evangelist George Whitefield began traveling throughout America and preaching at revival meetings in 1740, tens of thousands of new members joined New England churches. But some older ministers and members were uncomfortable with the new theology and also with the new enthusiastic, energetic nature of sermons and of participation by lay people. The conservatives, who became known as Old Lights, tried to hold on to previous traditions of hierarchy and formality and authority, while the New Lights leaned into the less formal church structure where even people without divinity degrees could preach and could lead congregations. This type of thing had been going on for a long time, of course, in other denominations, like the Quakers and the Baptists. And you might notice that similar ideas that had been talked about in the past had led to people like Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams being exiled from congregational communities. With all this focus on enthusiasm and energy, it's easy to imagine that the New Lights portrayed their beliefs in a more positive, uplifting tone. But this isn't necessarily true. Jonathan Edwards was notorious for his fire and brimstone sermons, such as "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," that his listeners said broke them down with despair over the hopelessness and helplessness of their position, before suggesting that they might possibly be saved if their faith was strong enough. However, shifting the focus away from the previous hierarchical structures of the Old Lights did provide some opportunities for women to have a bit more agency, if only in talking about their religious experiences. African Americans also, people such as Phyllis Wheatley, were energized by Whitefield's revival meetings and were inspired to imagine their lives in more religious contexts. Phyllis Wheatley became well known for her religious poetry. The final imperial war in North America before the American Revolution was the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1763, which is known as the 7 Years' War in Europe, because outside of North America it lasted from 1756 to 1763. But it began in North America over rival claims along the frontier in present-day western Pennsylvania. Well-connected planters from Virginia were facing stagnant tobacco prices, so they hoped that speculating in land on the frontier would protect their wealth and their status. They established the Ohio Company of Virginia in 1748, and the king granted the company 500,000 acres in 1749. However, in one of these conflicts on maps that isn't necessarily backed up on the ground, the French had also claimed the lands that the king had granted to the Ohio Company, and to protect the region, they had established Fort Duquesne in 1754, where the Monongahela and the Allegheny rivers meet to form the Ohio River. The British government sent a small force commanded by George Washington to challenge the French. 22-year-old Virginian George Washington, a planter's son, whose father had helped to start the Ohio Company, apparently started the war, with a command to his men to fire on French soldiers near present-day Uniontown, Pennsylvania. Fighting quickly spread along the frontier of New France and British America from Virginia to Maine. The war also spread over the next couple of years to Europe and Asia, as France and Britain fought to extend their empires. The British military performed pretty poorly in the first couple of years of the war. In 1754, at its beginning, the French and their allies forced Washington to surrender at Fort Necessity, which was a stockade that he had built really quickly in a swamp after his attack on the French. Washington laid down his arms, and the French, who at that time were still trying to avoid war, had simply disarmed the British and sent them home. Sensing weakness, in 1755, Britain dispatched General Edward Braddock to the colonies with orders to take Fort Duquesne. The French, aided by the Potawatomi, Ottawa, Shawnee, and the Lenape, ambushed 1,500 British soldiers and Virginia militia as they marched toward the fort. The attack killed hundreds of Virginia militiamen and British soldiers, including General Braddock. The only British victory at all in 1755 was their capture of Nova Scotia. In 1756 and 1757, Britain suffered further defeats with the fall of 2 more of their forts. The war began to turn in favor of the British in 1758 due to William Pitt, a very popular member of Parliament. Pitt pledged huge sums of money and resources to defeating the French, and Great Britain spent part of that money on bounties that they paid to new recruits in the colonies, helping to boost the British forces. And in 1758, the Iroquois, the Lenape, and the Shawnee signed the Treaty of Easton, allying themselves with the British in return for some contested lands in western Pennsylvania and Virginia. In 1759, the British took Quebec, and in 1760, they took Montreal. The French Empire in America crumbled. New France ceased to exist. But the fighting continued until 1763, when the French signed the Treaty of Paris, and the British Empire gained control of almost all of North America. The empire not only took over New France under the treaty, it also acquired some French sugar islands in the West Indies, and the French trading posts in India and on the west coast of Africa. The British victory in the French and Indian War made Great Britain a global empire. Fort Duquesne, on the western frontier, was renamed Fort Pitt in honor of William Pitt, and of course later it became Pittsburgh. So at the end of the war, ties between the colonies and Great Britain were closer than ever. Professional British soldiers had fought beside American militiamen, and that created a sense of shared identity. Colonial pride was high. The colonists sang Rule Britannia and celebrated their identities as British subjects, as Englishmen. Despite the celebrations, however, victory over France had produced massive war debt that became a serious problem for Parliament. Worse, the frontier had to remain defended to prevent the French from returning or the Indians from rebelling. Parliament had to raise revenue to pay for the war. And to do this, enforcement of imperial trade laws had to tighten. Everybody was expected to contribute their share, including British subjects on the western shores of the Atlantic. British colonies now extended from Canada to Florida, and Britain's military had to focus on maintaining peace in this newly enlarged territory. But of course, a lot of these changes had been on maps. Much of the land in the new American British Empire remained under the control of powerful native confederacies, which made claims of British dominion over this American empire kind of hollow. Great Britain quartered 10,000 troops in North America after the war ended in 1763 to defend colonial borders and to repel any potential attacks from imperial rivals. British colonists, eager for fresh land, poured over the Appalachian Mountains to stake their claims. The western frontier had become what some historians have called a middle ground, where different imperial powers, the British, the French, the Spanish, had interacted, and because none of them had had complete control, had had to compromise with native peoples. Accommodation in the middle ground, though, came to an end after the French and Indian War. Virginians, including George Washington, and other land-hungry colonists had been heightening the tensions as early as the 1740s with their land speculations. Virginia landowners were eager to diversify their interests beyond tobacco, which had not only stagnated in price in the international market, but had also exhausted the fertility of their soils along Chesapeake Bay. So they invested heavily in this newly available land. And this explosion of westward settlement by English Americans brought the colonists into conflict with tribes like the Shawnee, the Seneca Cayuga, the Wyandot, and the Lenape, who were increasingly willing to fight to hold their ground against any further intrusions by white settlers. The treaty that had ended the war between France and Great Britain was both dangerous and insulting to native peoples. With the French defeat, tribes who had sided with France lost an ally and a trading partner, as well as bargaining power over the British in the context of that middle ground politics. After the war, British troops took over the former French forts, but they failed to distribute gifts to local tribes, as the French had done before. Native leaders tried to remind the British that they had allowed the French to set up forts and trading posts, and they had never surrendered their sovereignty. The British also significantly reduced the amount of gunpowder and ammunition that they sold to the Indians, which worsened relations further. Indian resistance to the colonists coalesced around the teachings of a Lenape prophet named Neolin, and to some extent under the leadership of an Ottawa war chief named Pontiac. Neolin preached a policy of shunning European culture and expelling the Europeans from native lands. Pontiac echoed this idea, telling the tribes to join together against the British before it was too late. "It is important for us, my brothers, that we exterminate from our lands this nation which seeks only to destroy us," Pontiac said. So in a broad-based alliance that the British called Pontiac's Rebellion, the Ottawa warrior led, or at least participated, with a loose coalition of tribes against the colonists and the British Army. The conflict began in 1763, when Pontiac and several hundred Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Wyandot Hurons laid siege to Fort Detroit, while the Senecas, Shawnee, and Lenape besieged Fort Pitt. Over the next year, the war spread along the whole backcountry from Virginia to Pennsylvania. Pontiac's rebellion triggered horrific violence on both sides. Stories of brutal attacks that were heard even by English colonists far from the fighting incited a deep and a lasting racial hatred in the colonists against all Indians. An example of that is the actions of a group of settlers from Paxton, Pennsylvania in December 1763, which helps to illustrate the effect of white hatred of all Indians. A mob of Scots-Irish frontiersmen, who were known as the Paxton Boys, attacked a peaceful village of Conestoga Indians who were part of the Susquehannock tribe. The Conestoga had allied themselves with the local settlers, and in any case they were pacifists. But the Paxton Boys viewed all Indians as their enemies, and so they attacked the village and killed everyone they found in it, and burned all the homes. When Governor John Penn put the last 14 surviving Conestoga, mostly women and children, into protective custody in the Lancaster, Pennsylvania workhouse, the Paxton Boys broke into the building and killed and scalped and dismembered all the people that they found there. They killed everybody. Although Governor Penn offered a reward for the capture of the Paxton Boys, or anybody involved in the murder, nobody was willing to identify the attackers. A few colonists did react to this incident with outrage. Benjamin Franklin warned that, quote, "The wickedness cannot be covered. The guilt will lie on the whole land till justice is done on the murderers. The blood of the innocent will cry to heaven for vengeance." Yet, as the government's inability to bring the killers to justice kind of demonstrates, the Paxton Boys had many more supporters in Pennsylvania than they had critics. Pontiac's rebellion and the Paxton Boys' actions were early examples of American race wars, in which the sides began to see themselves as irreconcilably different from one another, and each side was convinced that the other needed to be eradicated. This was true of the Paxton Boys, and it was also probably true of Neal and Pontiac. But the decision of the Indians to defend their homeland from invaders isn't really equal to the attitude of the British, who regarded native peoples as a lesser race that must be moved out of the way of progress. In a letter suggesting that the British should make gifts to the natives of smallpox-infested blankets, Field Marshal Jeffrey Amherst instructed one of his colonels, "You will do well to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as every other method that can serve to extirpate this execrable race." Amherst, whose name is honored and memorialized by several towns and by a college in New England, was ennobled himself by the British crown and became the first Baron Amherst. Pontiac's rebellion came to an end in 1766, when it became clear that the French, whom Pontiac had hoped would side with his forces, would not be returning to the fight in North America. The repercussions, however, would last much longer. Race relations between Indians and whites remained poisoned on the frontier. Pontiac himself was assassinated in April of 1769 by another native from a tribe that was not allied with the rebellion. Although its officers were often eager to continue fighting Indians, the British government was very aware of the problems on the frontier and the cost of those problems. And so it took steps to try to prevent another expensive war. At the beginning of Pontiac's uprising, the British government issued the Proclamation of 1763, which forbid white settlement west of a borderline that ran along the spine of the Appalachian Mountains. Setting the proclamation line was Britain's attempt to prevent further conflict on the frontier. But the British colonists, who had hoped to move west, were shocked by the restriction. The Americans believed that they had just fought and won a war against the French and were now fighting a war against the Indians to ensure their right to settle the West. The proclamation line was a barrier to both the settlers' hopes for new farms and to the land speculators' expectation of profits on Western expansion. Great Britain's newly enlarged empire, as I said, had come with a price tag that nearly doubled the British national debt from £75 million in 1756 at the beginning of the war to £133 million in 1763 at its end. Interest payments made up over half of the national budget, and the ongoing presence of 10,000 troops in North America was a constant financial drain. The empire needed more revenue, and members of Parliament believed that British subjects in North America should carry their share of the financial burden. The British government began raising taxes, even as interest groups at home lobbied to keep their own taxes low. Powerful aristocrats who were well represented in Parliament prevented the government from raising taxes on land. The new tax burden, instead, would fall on the lower classes through increased tariffs and duties that raised the prices on imports like sugar and tobacco. A new Whig government under Prime Minister George Grenville promised to rein in the government spending and to make sure that the American colonists did their part to pay down the massive debt. Grenville introduced the Currency Act of 1764, prohibiting the colonies from printing their own paper money and bringing the American economy under greater British control. Grenville also pushed Parliament to pass the Sugar Act of 1764, which actually lowered duties on British molasses by half, from 6 pence per gallon to 3, but which actually began enforcing the tax and also requiring violators of the Navigation Acts to be tried in vice admiralty courts that operated without juries, instead of being tried locally and judged by their neighbors. Some colonists argued that trial by jury was a basic right of Englishmen. Depriving defendants of a jury, they said, meant reducing liberty-loving British subjects to political slavery. To make their arguments seem even more dramatic and to add to the pathos, some colonists began equating this loss of liberty to the enslavement of Africans. To make matters worse, Prime Minister Grenville introduced the Stamp Act in early 1765. Under this act, anyone who used or purchased anything printed on paper, from legal documents to playing cards, had to buy a revenue stamp for it. Before the Stamp Act, colonists had paid taxes only to their colonial governments, or indirectly through higher prices, but not directly to royal governors. The Stamp Act meant the colonists would be expected to contribute 60,000 pounds per year, which, although it shocked them, and they claimed it was a lot, it was only 17% of the total cost of the upkeep of the 10,000 British soldiers that were protecting North America. Parliament also asserted its power over the colonies with the Quartering Act of 1765, which required that soldiers be provided with barracks, or at least allowed to stay in public houses, but also declared that if extra housing did turn out to be necessary, soldiers could be housed in barns or other uninhabited private buildings. In addition, the costs of the soldiers' food and lodging would be paid by the colonists. The British colonists already distrusted the presence of a standing army during peacetime, and having to pay for the soldiers' lodging and food was especially annoying. The law was ignored in almost all of the colonies, but the issue was forced, and it was contentious in New York, which was the headquarters of the British forces. When 1,500 troops arrived in New York in 1766, the New York Colonial Assembly refused to follow the Quartering Act. Parliament was in charge of taxation, and although it was a representative body, the colonies did not have direct representatives in it. Protesters viewed themselves as having the same rights as all British subjects to avoid taxation without their consent. And while it was true that they hadn't been part of the decision-making process, the colonists were ignoring the fact that even if they had been represented in the House of Commons, their representatives would have been a tiny minority and would still not have been able to prevent the imposition of these new taxes. But for the British government, the colonists' objections were beside the point. Parliament believed that the relationship between the colonies and the empire was one of dependence, not of equality. The Stamp and Quartering Acts, though, had the unintended consequence of drawing colonists from very different regions and classes and viewpoints together in this protest. In Massachusetts, for example, James Otis, a lawyer and a defender of British liberty and the rights of Englishmen, became a leading voice of the idea that taxation without representation is tyranny. In the Virginia House of Burgesses, slaveholder Patrick Henry introduced the Virginia Stamp Act resolutions, which denounced the Stamp Act and the British Crown in such strong language that some conservative Virginians accused him of treason. And although the Stamp Act taxed documents and mostly impacted publishers and lawyers and other professionals, the Quartering Act affected people of all classes and turned the British troops that they had recently seen as brothers in arms into an expensive imposition. The residents of Britain's 13 central colonies in North America had never before really formed a unified political front. If you recall, they had failed even with the Plan of Union in Albany in 1754. So Grenville and Parliament didn't imagine them as being capable of acting together. However, responding to the Stamp Act, the Massachusetts Assembly sent letters to the other colonies asking them to send delegates to a Congress. Americans from very different colonies found common cause with each other in their opposition of this act. Representatives from 9 colonial legislatures met in New York in the fall of 1765 and drafted a rebuttal to the Stamp Act, making it clear that they were only trying to protect their liberty as loyal subjects of the Crown. The document, called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, outlined the unconstitutionality of taxation without representation and trials without juries. Meanwhile, popular protest was also gaining force. The Stamp Act Congress was a gathering of educated landowners and businessmen who represented the social and political elites of their colonies. They were the colonial equivalent of the British aristocracy. And while these gentlemen were drafting a formal expression of their grievances during the Stamp Act Congress that would be sent to their peers in Parliament, other colonists showed their distaste for the new laws by boycotting British goods and protesting in the streets. Two groups, the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty, led popular resistance to the Stamp Act. Formed in Boston in the summer of 1765, the Sons of Liberty were mostly artisans and shopkeepers and small merchants. Although the group's members were common people, many of its leaders were lawyers like James Otis and Patrick Henry when it spread to Virginia, or doctors like Joseph Warren and Thomas Young, or businessmen like Benedict Arnold and John Hancock. But these grand men were not above encouraging their followers to protest violently. Before the Stamp Act even went into effect, the Sons of Liberty began their protesting. In August, they took aim at Andrew Oliver, the lieutenant governor in Massachusetts who had been named the distributor of stamps. After hanging Oliver in effigy, the crowd stoned and ransacked his house and then beheaded the effigy and burned the remains. Andrew Oliver was intimidated and he resigned the next day. By that time, the mob had surrounded the home of Governor Thomas Hutchinson, and they had barricaded Hutchinson in his house and demanded that he also renounce the Stamp Act. When Hutchinson refused, the protesters looted and burned his house. The Sons of Liberty continued to lead violent protests aimed at forcing the resignations of all appointed stamp collectors in the colonies. Formed soon after, in early 1766, the Daughters of Liberty took a less violent path. They protested the Stamp Act by refusing to buy British goods and by boycotting British tea, instead making their own teas with local herbs and berries. Elite women held spinning bees, at which they competed to see who could produce the most homespun linen. The Daughters' non-importation movement broadened the protest against the Stamp Act and gave women a new active role in the political dissent of the time. Although women couldn't vote or hold official positions, they did, for the most part, manage the household finances. And they could vote with their purses, and they could mobilize others. And that would make a difference on the political landscape. Since women controlled most of the family budgets, their resistance was meaningful. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty organizations spread rapidly until there was a chapter in every colony. The Daughters of Liberty promoted the boycott on British goods, while the Sons enforced it, threatening retaliation against anyone who bought imported goods or who used stamped paper. In the protest against the Stamp Act, wealthy political figures like John Adams supported the goals of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, even if they didn't engage in violent actions. Lawyers and printers and merchants ran a propaganda campaign parallel to the Sons' campaign of violence. In newspapers and pamphlets throughout the colonies, they published the reasons the Stamp Act was unconstitutional and urged peaceful protest. The colonial elites officially condemned violent actions, but they didn't hunt down the protesters and have them arrested. A great degree of cooperation prevailed, despite the group's different economic backgrounds. In Great Britain, news of the colonists' reactions to the new laws worsened an already difficult political situation. Grenville's measures had already increased domestic taxes, and his growing unpopularity led to his dismissal by King George III. While many in Parliament still wanted financial reforms, British merchants argued for their repeal. Non-importation of British goods by the American colonists had actually hurt their businesses significantly. In March 1766, a new Prime Minister, Lord Rockingham, forced Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. Colonists celebrated what they saw as a victory for their British liberty. And in Boston, the merchant John Hancock treated the entire town to drinks. However, to appease people who feared the repeal would weaken parliamentary power over the American colonies, Rockingham also pushed through the Declaratory Act, which stated that Parliament's power was supreme and that any laws that the colonies may have passed to govern and tax themselves were null and void if they ran counter to parliamentary law. Lord Rockingham's term as Prime Minister only lasted a year this time. British landowners feared that if he did not raise enough revenue in the colonies, then Parliament would have to raise their taxes instead. His successor, William Pitt, was sympathetic to the colonies, but by this time was old and ill. Pitt's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, took on the duty of raising the needed revenue from the colonies. Townshend passed a bunch of laws that together are called the Townshend Acts. First was the Restraining Act of 1767, which disbanded the New York Assembly that had voted not to pay for the garrison of British soldiers, and they would remain disbanded until they agreed to obey the Quartering Act's requirements. And then the Townshend Revenue Act of 1767 placed duties on consumer goods like paper and paint and lead and tea and glass that the colonies needed but did not manufacture themselves. The Indemnity Act of 1767 exempted tea produced by the British East India Company from taxation when it was imported into Great Britain. But then when the tea was re-exported to the colonists did have to pay taxes on it because of the Revenue Act. Critics of Parliament on both sides of the Atlantic saw this tax policy as an example of corrupt politicians giving preferable treatment to specific corporate interests, and thus creating a monopoly. To ensure compliance with his Revenue Act, Townshend introduced the Commissioners of Customs Act in 1767 as well, which created an American Board of Customs to enforce the trade laws. In the past, customs enforcement had been based in Great Britain, but the rules were very difficult to implement at such a distance, and smuggling was rampant. The new Customs Board was based in Boston and severely curtailed smuggling. Townshend also orchestrated the Vice Admiralty Court Act, which established 3 more Vice Admiralty courts in Boston and Philadelphia and Charleston to try violators of customs regulations, again without a jury. Since the judges in these courts were paid a percentage of the value of the monies they recovered, leniency was rare. The Townshend Acts resulted in higher taxes and stronger British power to enforce them. Like the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts triggered protests in the American colonies. For the second time, many colonists objected to being taxed without representation and deprived of their British liberty. The fact that the revenue that Townshend Acts raised would pay royal governors only made the situation worse, because it took control away from colonial legislatures that had otherwise had the power to set and, if they chose, to withhold the royal governor's salary. The Restraining Act, which had been intended to isolate New York without angering the other colonies, had the opposite effect, showing the rest of the colonies how far beyond the British Constitution some members of Parliament were willing to go. The Townshend Acts also generated a number of protest publications. In 1768, Boston businessman Samuel Adams wrote a letter that became known as the Massachusetts Circular, sent by the Massachusetts House of Representatives to the other colonial assemblies. The letter laid out the unconstitutionality of taxation without representation and encouraged the other colonies to again protest the taxes by boycotting British goods. Great Britain's response to Sam Adams' mild threat of disobedience only united the colonies further. The Secretary of State for the colonies demanded that Massachusetts retract the letter, promising that any colonial assemblies that endorsed it would be dissolved. But instead of intimidating them, this threat pushed the other colonies to the Massachusetts side. Even the city of Philadelphia, which had originally opposed the circular, came around. The Daughters of Liberty once again promoted boycotting British goods. Women resumed their spinning bees and again found substitutes for British tea and other goods. Many colonial merchants signed non-importation agreements, and the Daughters urged colonial women to shop only with these merchants. The Sons of Liberty used newspapers and circulars to name and shame merchants who refused to sign non-importation agreements. Sometimes they even threatened violence. The boycott in 1768 and 1769 turned the buying of consumer goods into a political gesture. It mattered what you bought, and the clothes you wore indicated whether you were a defender of liberty in homespun or a protector of parliamentary rights, wearing fine British textiles. The Massachusetts Circular got Parliament's attention, and in 1768, the government sent 4,000 British troops to Boston to put down any potential rebellion there. The troops were a constant reminder of British power over the colonies and an illustration of an unequal relationship between subjects of the same empire. As an added aggravation, British soldiers moonlighted as dock workers, creating competition for jobs. Bostonians, led by the Sons of Liberty, began a campaign of harassing the British troops. The Sons of Liberty also helped protect the smuggling operations of the merchants, since smuggling was crucial to the colonists' ability to maintain their boycott of British goods. John Hancock was one of Boston's most successful merchants and most prominent citizens. While he maintained too high a profile to work actively with the Sons of Liberty, it was well known that Hancock supported their aims, financially as well as morally. He was also one of the many prominent merchants who had made their fortunes, partly by smuggling. In 1768, customs officials seized the Liberty, one of his ships, and Bostonians rioted, attacking the customs house and chasing out the officers. British troops responded and crushed these riots, but over the next few years, clashes between British officials and Bostonians became common. Conflict turned deadly on March 5th, 1770, in a confrontation that became known as the Boston Massacre. A crowd of Bostonians started throwing snowballs and rocks and sticks at 7 British soldiers who were guarding the customs house. The soldiers, goaded by the mob, fired into the crowd and killed 5 people. Crispus Attucks, the first man killed, was an escaped slave of Wampanoag and African descent. The Sons of Liberty immediately seized on this event, portraying the British soldiers as murderers and their victims as martyrs. Paul Revere, a silversmith and a member of the Sons of Liberty, produced an engraving that showed a line of grim redcoats firing ruthlessly into a crowd of unarmed, fleeing civilians. Among colonists who had begun to think of themselves as patriots, this view of the massacre confirmed their fears of a tyrannous government using its armies to attack their freedom. But to others, the mob was equally to blame for pelting the British with rocks and insulting them. John Adams, one of the city's strongest supporters of peaceful protest against Parliament, represented the British soldiers at their murder trial. Adams argued that the soldiers were the tools of an unjust imperial policy. And of the 8 soldiers on trial, the 7 who had fired and their captain, the jury acquitted 6, and it convicted the other 2 of a reduced charge of manslaughter. But long after the trial, the Sons of Liberty maintained a relentless propaganda campaign against British oppression. Newspaper articles and pamphlets implied that the massacre had been a planned murder. In the Boston Gazette, a week after the incident in March 1770, an article described the soldiers as striking first. Ironically, the Boston Massacre took place after the British Parliament had already voted to partially repeal the Townshend Acts. By the late 1760s, this American boycott of British goods had drastically reduced British trade. Once again, merchants who were losing money in the boycott had pressured Parliament to loosen these restrictions and to break the non-importation movement. Charles Townshend died suddenly in 1767 and was replaced by Lord North, who was much more inclined to look for a solution with the colonists. North convinced Parliament to drop all the Townshend duties except the tax on tea. To those who had protested the Townshend Acts for several years, the partial repeal seemed like a major victory once again. For a second time, the colonists had rescued their liberty as Englishmen from the unconstitutional parliamentary measures. The hated troops in Boston departed. Consumption of British goods skyrocketed again after the partial repeal. And this suggests that at this time, in 1770, the American colonists were continuing to think of themselves as members of the empire and just wanted to be treated in a way that they believed was fair. Obviously, this was soon to change, but we'll get to that next week. That's all for now. So I hope you found this a little bit interesting. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.